I'd like to welcome Jamal Myers again. Jamal Myers is a Scarborough resident, transit activist, and community builder. He has been organizing for better transit for Scarborough since February 2018 with Scarborough Transit Action, a grassroots transit advocacy organization. His focus is on ensuring equitable access to the TTC via planning, affordability, and accessibility. In addition to his transit advocacy, he is a lawyer for TD Bank and a board member for the Scarborough Business Association, the voice of Scarborough's business community, and Taibu, a community health center based in Melbourne, which serves the health and wellness needs of Black Canadians living in the GTA and the Melbourne community. So with that said, I'm going to hand things over to you, Jamal.
Hi, well, thank you. So thank you for having me. And I'll just give you the next slide, please. Or can I
Uh-huh.
click?
Yep.
Okay,
Oh, sorry. Yep. There we go.
okay. So like Anna said, my name is Jamal Myers and I'm an organizer with Scarborough Transit Action. And I've been organizing since February 2018. And I actually had spent a year, I spent a year actually as a community organizer in Scarborough around better transit and better public health with Scarborough Transit Action. And one of the reasons I thought actually involved the transit is like a very simple story. So when I was living in New York and I had been there for 7.5 years, and when I decided to come back to Scarborough, I was going to take time off, so I decided to move in with my grandmother because I wasn't going to work. And we live at 401 in Nielsen. And one day we were talking about taking the bus. She wanted to take the bus to Malvern, and she couldn't access the bus stop because it was across the street, and there was no crosswalk to access it safely. So for me, it was kind of that aha moment. Like I've crossed this street so many times. I pretty much grew up in this house, and I had never once considered the fact that there wasn't a crosswalk there, because for me, I never had to think about crossing that street safely. It was very easy. But when I saw it through my grandmother's eyes, I'm like, wow, this bus stop is inaccessible if you're in a wheelchair, if you're elderly, if you're a student, if you're have mobility issues, if you're blind. And then it just sort of got me thinking about transit from a whole different perspective. And yeah, so that's kind of the lens I take whenever I think of something. I always say, would this be useful for my grandmother? And that's a very easy way to think about it. And if it's useful for her, generally it'll be useful for everyone else. Next slide. So I'm just going to give a brief overview on Scarborough's transit infrastructure. Next slide. So as anyone who's ever taken transit in Scarborough knows, getting around via TTC is frustrating and exhausting. A big reason for this is that access to rapid transit in Scarborough, in order to get it, you first have to take a bus in order to access rapid transit. So if you're going to Kennedy, Scarborough Town Center, Warden, whatever, or the GO train, you usually have to take a bus to get there. So as you can see from the chart, 5 of the 13 busiest bus routes in Toronto are in Scarborough. So it's important to remember that when it comes to transit in Scarborough, buses are key as they provide the gateway that most people use in order to access rapid transit, i.e. they're going to GO station, they're going to the subway stop, or they're going to an SRT stop. So I think just looking at these numbers sort of just gives you an overview of just how important it is that buses are sort of central to whatever transit plan we come up with in Scarborough. Next slide, please. So because of our reliance on buses, most of Scarborough is considered a, quote, transit desert, which are generally defined as urban areas full of transit-dependent people, usually city residents who are low income, elderly, disabled, or all of the above, but they lack sufficient transit service. So when we have a transit system like Scarborough that is mostly reliant on buses, you're often traveling long distances to get to the destination because of the spread out nature of the neighborhood. So you can just think of your own neighborhood and just how far it takes to get from one neighborhood to the other, or even just to get to the bus stop. That for me, I'm an able-bodied man. It takes me about 2 minutes to get to the bus stop. For my grandmother, it would take about 10 minutes. And then it would take her another 10 minutes in order to get to the bus stop with the crosswalk that she could use. So just to sort of think of it like that. So even in areas where the bus stops are, and even in areas where the bus stops are located less than 500 meters apart, they can still be considered transit deserts if the stops are in areas that were designed for cars, and pedestrians are often forced to cross busy 6-lane avenues to reach their stop. So, i.e., my neighborhood. And this map sort of just gives you an overall view of what sort of the transit desert looks like. And if you notice, Scarborough has a lot of white, which is a 0. Some of that is due to the fact that it's the Rouge Park, but a lot of that is just due to the fact that we just have very poor transit in Scarborough. And the next chart sort of gives you a comparison that every single neighborhood in Scarborough has a transit score below the average of the city of Toronto. So anywhere in Scarborough, you have worse transit than the average neighborhood anywhere else in Toronto. So that sort of just gives you the context. Next slide, please. So why is this important to know? Well, as a result of COVID-19, we're experiencing planned service cuts. So Scarborough's transit users can expect to wait even longer times for buses, and they can expect the elimination of certain bus routes altogether. So this matters for 2 big reasons. First, Scarborough transit users already have the longest waits in the city, but because most of us can only access the TTC via bus. So I'm the perfect example. I work downtown every day. I need to get to Scarborough Town Center in order to get to Kennedy. I can't get to Scarborough Town Center unless my 133 Nielsen comes to pick me up. And that's the case for most people, whether you're traveling around Scarborough or you're going downtown like I am. Many people in Scarborough don't drive. Walking is not a reasonable option due to the neighborhood layout, and it can be dangerous to ride a bike on our main roads. So now that we expect commute times to be even longer, we're likely to see this is going to affect people's ability to run errands, to get to work, or even access childcare. So just giving you sort of like the current layout, the current layout of Scarborough, you can sort of see that, buses that were now taking 23 minutes, so the 12 Kingston Road, are now going to, instead of arriving every 20 minutes, they're now going to arrive every 23 minutes. Overall, the service levels are going to be reduced by 16%, and about 1,200 TTC employees are going to be laid off. The second reason, keep going. Next slide. So I just wanted to give you also a big sort of overview on the Scarborough subway extension. So this is important for several reasons. One, this is going to cost, these 3 stops are going to cost $6 billion. And we sort of all know the facts of, whether the Scarborough subway is good or bad. That's not really kind of what I want to get into. What I really want to explain is sort of just how this is being positioned to the community. So the first thing I'd like to point your attention to is to that gray dotted line at the top. So that is presented as a future subway. But there's actually no money for that. That's never actually been proposed, and it's never been even studied. But any map of the Scarborough subway will always show that gray dotted line as if to show that it's inevitable. Well, it's not. It's really just part of the, I guess, the push that a lot of people who are invested in this project have been making to sort of show how it's connected, where in reality, it's not connected at all. The other thing I'd like to point your attention to is that the SRT moves about 35,300 people a day. So if you look at the numbers they're providing, they're saying that they will be having 52,000 new users every day. So that is quite a leap from 35,300 per day versus and adding an additional 52,000 people a day. So if you just think about it from sort of like a common sense perspective, you're getting rid of, as you can see on the map, you're getting rid of Lawrence of Ellesmere and Midland. So all of those people who currently can walk to the RT stops now have to take a bus. And the way they are coming up with these numbers is that yellow around the Scarborough Town Center, they are proposing that it's going to be this downtown Scarborough where there's going to be condos and business areas, and that's just not very realistic, just based on what we know about Scarborough. And but it's kind of how they've tried to sell this as sort of creating a new downtown Scarborough. And you can just look at the numbers to know that it's just not very likely. And also a big reason they're getting these numbers is they're assuming that if you build the subway, people will get out of their cars. And again, that's not likely for the reasons I've already discussed, because in order to get to the rapid transit stops, you're going to still have to take a bus or you're going to have to drive there. And most people aren't going to give up their cars to drive to a subway station. Even if they're saying, 38,000 people within a 10-minute walk to a station, that's very optimistic, shall we say, because most people are going to walk 10, 15, 20 minutes, 25 minutes max. And that is an able-bodied person. If you have any sort of mobility issues, you're very unlikely to make that walk. But none of those things are sort of like influenced in Metrolinx's calculations. So whenever you see these numbers and these plans, it's important to just take a pause and think about what's behind these numbers and what's driving them. Next slide, please. So this is sort of just a comparison of what we could have had. So we could have had three LRT lines, which are light rapid transit lines, one going along Shepherd East from Don Mills all the way out to the zoo, one going along Eglinton East, then up Kingston, then up Meadowvale, Morningside, sorry, to the University of Toronto Scarborough, and then a third one, going along the current SRT route with 2 extra stops, one at Centennial College Progress, and then a final terminus stop at Malvern Town Centre. And this would have been paid for by the province of Ontario. And had we just stuck with this plan, the Scarborough RT, so the blue line, would have actually been completed this year. And to give you a sense of just how fast it is, it would have taken someone 18 minutes to get from Malvern Town Centre to Kennedy. Currently, that can take upwards of 40 minutes. So this would have basically cut your travel time in half. So for people in Malvern where jobs are scarce, this could have been a huge game changer, but unfortunately that's not going to happen anymore. The other great thing about this plan was that it would have served 7 priority neighborhoods. It would have served Malvern, it would have served University of Toronto Scarborough, it would have served Centennial Progress, and Centennial Morningside. The subway plan only serves 1 priority neighborhood, so it's not really helping the people that need it the most. And it's one of the big drawbacks of this to the current plan is that it doesn't actually help the people who need transit currently. Next slide, please. So the next area I'd like to touch on is TTC affordability. There are so many issues with people just not being able to afford to use the TTC, whether it's the price, whether it's their inability, they don't have Wi-Fi, so they can't load up their card. Next slide, please. And these issues are sort of amplified in Scarborough. So this slide is called the problem with Presto. And I mean, it should actually be problems. So if you know, so the first thing to note is just to get the Presto card, it's $6. Prior to that, you could just buy a token, you could buy cash, or sorry, pay cash, or you could buy your tickets. Now, just to get the Presto card, it's $6. So for a lot of low-income people, that just cuts them out. That's prohibitive. The second thing is just the cost to actually load the card. So if you load it at a TTC station, it's going to cost you $5 minimum, which a lot of people just don't have. If you load it at the GO train or an Up Express station, it's a $10 minimum. If you load it at a Shoppers Drug Mart, they now allow you to do it, or Shoppers Drug Mart or a local or a customer service outlet, they now allow you to have a 5 cents minimum. So for Scarborough, there aren't that many customer service outlets, but there are a few Shoppers Drug Marts. The problem is, though, the Shoppers Drug Mart area coverage in Scarborough isn't very wide. So if you look at the first map, that's where you could previously have bought, your tickets or your tokens. So your convenience store, just your your shopping mall, whatever, you could just walk there. And the circles sort of represent the walking radius. And that covered pretty much most of Scarborough. Now, under the new model where Presto cards are only allowed to be sold at and refilled at Shoppers for purposes of Scarborough or the subway stations, you can see there are so many holes, so many gaps in the coverage area. And a lot of these places are in the neighborhood improvement areas. So the priority neighborhoods, the lowest income neighborhoods. And these circles don't even represent the full scales to say if you're a senior, if you have mobility issues, just how difficult it is to access Presto. Next slide, please. So the second thing that affects affordability of the TTC is that fare revenue makes up 2/3 of the TTC's operating budget, and the city's subsidy makes up the remaining 1/3. So this is, I think, the highest in North America in terms of a transit system dependent on fares for revenue in order to run. So it costs $3.25 for a single cash fare, $3.20 for a Presto single fare, and with the Fare Pass transit discount program, you could cardholders save and about $1.05 on the adult fare, so that's about a third, and $31.75 on the adult monthly pass. However, these must be loaded on the Presto card, so you need to actually purchase the Presto card before you can take advantage of the Fare Pass transit discount. And you have to be on either Ontario Disability Support, Ontario Works, or getting a child care subsidy. And that the child care subsidy was only expanded recently. So I just wanted to show you just sort of how seriously the Toronto transit system takes fare evasion. So if you are caught if you don't pay your fare, you could be fined up to $235. That is more than that's more than failing to report an accident. That is more than you're fined if you're approaching a streetcar door when you're driving. If you fail to surrender your Presto card, so like you're getting off the bus and you don't show your Presto card to be inspected so that they can verify that you pay, the fine is $425. That's more than running a stop sign, and it's more than failing to stop for an emergency vehicle. So in effect, the TTC has in some ways almost treated people who can't afford to pay their fare system as people that are worse than running a red light. And it's kind of crazy if you think about it, because nobody's ever died because someone hasn't paid their fare, whereas people die if you run a red light. Next slide, please. So the next topic I want to talk to you about is TTC service levels. So this picture was actually taken in the COVID era, and obviously it's packed, it's full. A lot of people aren't wearing masks. If you look, it's obviously not scientific, but if you look, most of the people in the picture are people of color. And these are generally the people who, through statistics, have shown to be the ones that have been getting sick and infected from COVID-19. So next slide, please. So so I don't have the latest figures, but when COVID-19 initially hit, there were serious fears over overcrowding. And this heat map kind of shows where the most serious areas were. The bus routes affected were the 102 Markham, the Eglinton East buses, the 54 Lawrence East, the Shepherd East buses, and the intersection of Markham and Lawrence. And the yellow indicates that it's a known hotspot, whereas the red is it's getting more and more crowded. It was getting more and more dangerous. As of now, the TTC has said they've tried to remedy the situation, but we were continually hearing reports of people who are getting on crowded buses. I've started using the buses more frequently now, and I've noticed that the buses are actually still quite crowded. A lot of the precautions that they were taking before, like backdoor, rear door entry, have now been stopped. I think because they wanted to cut down on fare evasion, so they have people now entering to the front. And a lot of the not a lot, but some of the buses actually don't have the spacing anymore, indicated that some seats are reserved for no one to sit so that people can practice social distancing. Next slide, please. So I just want to talk briefly about the Scarborough RT. So the Scarborough RT began service in 1985, and it had a 30-year lifespan. So it was due to be decommissioned in 2015. The TTC did repairs on this, so they extended the lifespan. Because the technology is old and out of date, the parts that are actually used to create the SRT are no longer produced. The technology is out of date. We all know this because if you've ever ridden it, you feel kind of like you're on a roller coaster. It's jiggling, and then you can just see, like, from the physical upkeep of the cars themselves, they seem like they're worn. Whether they're using tape to keep the floors down, or their seatings with graffiti on, that's just because there aren't the parts anymore to replace it. And if you take the SRT frequently, like I do, you know that it repeatedly breaks down in the winter. At least it's going to break down at least once in the winter, and then everyone's going to be stuck on the shuttle bus. So the line, because of the work to extend the SRT's life, the line is supposed to last for another 6 years until the Scarborough subway extension is operational. Not many people believe that it's going to last that long. So in the interim, it's likely that there will have to be some sort of shuttle bus service operating between Scarborough Town Center and Kennedy. And as of now, the TTC doesn't really have a plan of creating the shuttle bus service, making sure there are enough buses, making sure that people can socially distance on the buses, and making sure that there's a route so that the buses aren't in mixed traffic. So for me, it takes me an hour and a half to get to the office. This will probably add another half an hour to my journey. So that's just giving you a sense of just how long the commutes are in Scarborough. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to give you an overview of sort of like transit decision making in Toronto. So as we all know, transit decision making in Toronto it's insane, for lack of a better word. And if you're a Simpsons fan like I am, you automatically know the reference to the Springfield monorail, where, you know, after a song and dance, Springfield decided that they were going to build a monorail. And, you know, it's funny, but like Toronto isn't really that much different because, you know, we had subways. At least Springfield had a song. We just got a slogan. And on the left, you see John Tory's, you know, Smart Track plan, which was supposed to be 14 stations, which were supposed to be built at almost no cost to the taxpayer using the existing surface rail system. As of now, I don't think any of those stations have been built, and nobody kind of talks about it anymore. But it just goes to show you just how really the transit plan in Toronto isn't based on data. It's sort of based on whoever's in power. So the transit plan was different when Mel Lastman was in power. It was different when David Miller was in power. It was different when Rob Ford was in power. And now it's different when John Tory is in power. And it's going to be different whenever who replaces him. And that's a problem because there's no consistency in sort of planning. There's no standards. There's no criteria in sort of gathering evidence in order to make the best decision. Next slide, please. So this is just sort of gives you an overview of sort of the Scarborough subway extension. Just it has a very convoluted planning history. So if you remember back in 2010, as shown on the previous slide, David Miller had this grand plan of Transit City where he would basically use light rail transit to sort of connect the inner suburbs. So there was supposed to be LRTs in Etobicoke, North York, and Scarborough. So in 2010, this was approved, the 7-stop LRT, to replace the current SRT with stops along at Centennial Progress and at the final stop at Malvern Town Center. So in 2013, the city changed the plan to a 3-stop subway extension. Metrolinx, back when it was initially set up, had actually run the numbers and concluded that a 3-stop subway extension was not a worthwhile use of money. Fast forward 7 years later, and now it is. In 2016, because the cost of the 3-stop subway was just astronomical, and they were building a high-density transit mode in a fairly not very densely populated area. It was the suburbs. They changed it to a 1-stop subway extension, and they combined it with the Eglinton East LRT. So both projects were to be built within this cost envelope of $3.56 billion. But again, the cost of the Scarborough subway extension quickly rose, and it ate up all of the money, so there was nothing left over for the Eglinton East LRT. That's initially how that route got defunded. So in 2019, the city and the province struck an agreement whereby the province would build the Scarborough subway extension and reconfigure it as a 3-stop subway. And this was sort of included in the province's plan for Toronto. Now the cost of that $3.56 billion has risen to between $5.5 to $6 billion. And currently, Metrolinx is taking bids in order to start the request for qualifications. That being said, there are serious doubts of whether this can get built, because the only way it can get built is if the feds provide the money, because Ontario just does not have the money to build this subway. So next slide, please. So some of you may have seen, I think 2 weeks ago, I actually wrote an article on anti-Black racism in the TTC. And one of the best parts about the article was, or at least one of the most exciting parts in my opinion, was that I was actually able to show on a map that the Eglinton East LRT, the route itself, it actually goes through these neighborhood improvement areas. And the darker spots represent areas in Scarborough with higher Black populations. So yeah, Eglinton East, Kennedy Park, Pineview, Scarborough Village, Morningside, Highland Creek, Malvern. And if you see, it's almost as if the Eglinton East would go directly through these communities and serve their interests. And then you look at the subway, and basically it's an area with 0 to 1% Black people. So it is not really serving the interest of people that are marginal, people that have experienced mobility issues or have trouble accessing the TTC. It's really just reinforcing the status quo. So I looked into this, and this was part of an argument that Jay Pitter had made. Whenever you're wondering about sort of how these decisions are made, look at the people making the decisions. So that sort of prompted me to look at the TTC board and see that 9 out of 10 of them are white. And then I looked at the Metrolinx board, and I found that 12 out of 13 of them are white. And there were no Black people on either of these boards, and there were no Black people on the senior executive teams of either of these agencies. So that's 24 people in total. So that's out of 47 possible people, there was not one Black person serving in that position. And then you sort of wonder, okay, well, why did the TTC make the decisions that they made during the pandemic? So I had said earlier that the TTC laid off 1,200 employees, because they were losing $92 million a month and ridership was way down. The TTC didn't lay off, of those 1,200 employees, the TTC did not lay off one fare inspector, and actually went through with a plan to hire additional 50 more fare inspectors, with 20 more starting in October. So it's been shown, despite the TTC's denial, that the fare inspectors disproportionately impacted Black residents. So between 2008 and 2018, 47,000 tickets were given out by TTC fare inspection officers for various reasons. 18.5% of the recipients were Black, despite the fact that Black people only accounted for 10.7% of the transit users. So the portions vary. So initially it was 23.5% back in 2018, and then it fell to 15.2% in 2018. So that kind of just gives you an idea that, when, people of color, marginalized people, poor people say that they're being targeted, it's not in their head, it's actually happening. Whether you have the proof or not, it's kind of at the point now where you have to sort of prove that you're being discriminated against, and hopefully we're moving away from that sort of way of thinking where it's no longer up to me to prove that I'm being targeted because I'm a minority. It's for the agency to prove that it's not targeting minorities. So that's sort of hopefully the paradigm that we're shifting to. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to give you sort of like an overview on some of the campaigns that we've done that I've been fortunate to be able to participate in order to campaign for better transit in Scarborough. This was actually a march that we had planned. I believe it was either 2018 or 2019, where we actually held a march and a rally for better transit in Scarborough. And this was to build the Eglinton East LRT to Malvern. So we started off in Malvern and we actually marched all the way to MPP VJ's office in Scarborough Rouge Park. Next slide, please. And about 70 people showed up. So another area that we, took in order to raise awareness and keep the pressure, and Anna and I worked together on this, was having the Eglinton East LRT Town Hall. It was jointly organized by SCAN and the Scarborough Transit Action. We had a solid turnout of 70 people, at least 70 people.
We got 200 people showed up, actually.
Okay, 200
very
people.
well attended, yeah.
200 people showed up. We got very good media coverage. The media was there. CP24, City TV, Toronto Star, etc. John Tory was there, as shown in the picture. Jennifer McKelvey was one of the speakers. Shelley Carroll showed up, and Mitzi Hunter also attended. So those are all of the good things that we got, and those are the things that we wanted to get. We wanted to generate, we wanted to keep the pressure up. We wanted to show that there was strong support for this project. And we wanted other people in Toronto to know that people in Scarborough wanted this project more than they wanted the subway. So the cons were, it was a success, the event itself, but in terms of actual affecting the outcome, that didn't work. That didn't happen. The Eglinton East LRT was still effectively defunded, despite the fact that John Tory stood there and he said, I'm going to do everything possible to make sure the Eglinton East LRT comes to Scarborough. And every single politician, from Jennifer McKelvey to Mitzi Hunter, they all made the same promise, but when it came to actually putting in the action and doing the work, they were silent. And they were happy to have the project die in order to help the Scarborough subway. Next slide, please. So one of the more recent successful campaigns has been the dedicated bus lanes. So this in Scarborough, at least, I think it's fair to say this was pushed by SCAN and TTC riders. And it actually was a success because the TTC board voted to create a priority bus lane along Eglinton East by fall, as shown on the map. So Toronto Council is supposed to vote for this next week. And the con is, though, the status of Finch East and Lawrence East are unclear. And a big reason that I think Eglinton East was sort of prioritized was, one, it was along the Eglinton East LRT route, but two, three of the councillors, Paul Ainsley and Jennifer McKelvey, were really pushing for it. They did actually get behind this project, whereas Finch East and Lawrence East, they don't really have champions. Michael Thompson really isn't that interested in making a dedicated bus lane along Lawrence, and Cynthia Lai, and there's no one currently in Scarborough Agincourt, but Cynthia Lai really isn't interested in ensuring that Finch East has a dedicated bus lane. Next slide, please. So another successful campaign that was undertaken was to stop the subway upload. So that was Doug Ford's plan to upload the TTC to the subway system and to leave the rest of it to Toronto. So basically he was going to break the TTC apart, which means that, you know, one of the great things about the TTC is that I can pay for the bus and it's going to take me directly into the subway station. A lot of cities, that's not the case. They're two separate systems. You have to pay a separate fare to enter the subway, then the separate fare that you use for the bus. So this was a big campaign. Scarborough Transit Action, TTC riders, and ATU 113, which is the union representing TTC workers, worked together to stop the subway upload. There was a lot of flyering, a lot of pamphleting, a lot of calls made to councillors and MPPs, and eventually Doug Ford dropped the plan and he backed down. The con was that Toronto eventually entered into a partnership anyways to permit Ontario to build this Ontario line, which basically ripped apart all the plans that Toronto had made for the downtown relief line. And they then went forward with the Scarborough subway extension, which again, as shown before, doesn't really do that much for Scarborough. And it's hard to think of this as really a win. The government backed down, but we didn't actually get anything new. We sort of just preserved the status quo. And the thing about transit, campaigning for better transit, a lot of the quote wins aren't actually improvements, unfortunately. It's keeping things from getting worse. So you definitely have to be in this for the long haul. Next slide, please. So these are just sort of some of the outcomes and successes that I've sort of just had that I just thought I would just list. So the town hall, the Eglinton East, the March for Malvern, the LRT coalition was basically SCAN working with Scarborough Transit Action, working with 42 Voices, working with Connect Shepherd East in order to build public awareness on the need for better transit rather than sort of pursuing the issue separately. We were much more effective when we worked as a group. Another issue was, you know, writing the article for the Star that sort of highlighted the issue of anti-Black racism in the TTC, stopping the Scarborough upload. And we actually worked together, the same group, on submitting a letter to the Auditor General asking them to look into the procurement and the planning of the Scarborough subway extension, because basically Metrolinx, in order to approve that, had to go around its own rules and guidelines in order to get the green light. Some of the biggest failures I've had are working with politicians, working with bureaucrats. That is really a tough battle to have, especially if you're in Scarborough. You really are considered a second-class citizen. I felt it personally. And the other big thing is sort of creating mass actions among the public. So we're great at educating the public, providing them information, getting them the information they have. What we were never really good at was then getting them to use that information to actually do something with it. So if you give people the education, that's great. but unless they actually do something with it, then it's not going to be very effective. And I think that's one of the biggest takeaways I had from my year as an organizer. Next slide, please. So some of the key issues facing, socioeconomically challenged communities in Scarborough. I think really as organizers, it's key that you have to build relationships with other organizers in Scarborough. Like that is key. So for instance, just to give you a sort of like a quick example, the Right to Ride campaign was initiated by SCAN and TTC riders. Anna and Sheila, who is the ED of TTC Riders, sent me a letter asking if I could get the Scarborough Business Association to write a letter in support of bus-only lanes. And I was happy to do it because I had that pre-existing relationship with Anna. I knew Anna. I was willing to write the letter. I was willing to make sure that we got the proper approval for the board, and I was willing to push it through. If you didn't have that pre-existing relationship, that would be very difficult to do. That letter, that request to write a letter would have just sort of went into an inbox and it would have been ignored. You really need like these relationships are key, especially when people are involved in multiple organizations, because you never know when someone can be really help push the envelope forward. So another instance is I sit on the board of Taibu Community Health Center. We're a health center, but I still got the board to pass a resolution in support of the Eglinton East LRT and to publicly come out in support of it. So that's a win. That's a big win. Again, action over education. Fare enforcement's another big issue that a lot of people have been working on. I don't think it's as big an issue. I think that sort of campaign is more centered around downtown because that's sort of where the action is. But it is definitely an issue that affects marginalized communities in Scarborough. Overcrowding is another big issue. So we had, very high rates of COVID-19 infection in Scarborough. I think they were the highest in Toronto. And I don't have proof, but I'm thinking a lot of that had to do with the fact that people were riding crowded buses. They were riding crowded buses and they were getting sick and they were going to different nursing homes and they were going home and they were infecting other people. So that's just sort of a way that sort of plays out on a real life basis. Another big issue is accessibility. So, the simple point of my grandmother's unable to use the bus stop. That reality plays out over and over and over again in Scarborough. If you are in a wheelchair, if you have mobility issues, if you have some sort of disability with your sight, if you're a child, it can be extremely dangerous to access certain bus stops in Scarborough. And to get the city to make the necessary improvements, whether that's putting in a crosswalk, changing the location, or even just sort of putting in some traffic calming measures is extremely difficult. I know this because my own counselor tried to put in a crosswalk for the bus stop by our house, and the city said no. So if my counselor can't do it, what chance do I have of doing it? But one of the key sort of areas where you can sort of change the narrative is connecting with people who have lived experiences, who can sort of tell that story of how it affects them on that day-to-day basis. It's very different when you're telling something, sort of explaining it with stats and numbers versus just explaining it how it affects you on a day-to-day basis. And I think connecting with those people and getting them to share their stories is key to sort of making those improvements in transit. Next. So engaging with the public. Some of the lessons I've learned, always keep it simple. If anything is over one page, chances are, especially transit, which is complicated, not everyone finds it really interesting, you've got to keep it simple. Keep it straight to the point and use language that everyone can understand because not everyone speaks English. Keep it short, like I said before. Use visual aids, so you notice in the presentation. I use a lot of pictures, and that just helps keeps people attention more rather than me just droning on and seeing that there and then people reading the text. It really helps to sort of have that visual impact. It's the same thing when I wrote the article. The map really made the difference in terms of helping people see how anti-Black racism plays a role in TTC's planning. So consider the language of the target audience. A lot of times we had trouble penetrating into certain communities, Chinese community, Tamil community, especially. Finding someone who speaks their language and who knows their culture, knows their experiences, lives in their neighborhoods is absolutely key. That is a big factor in terms of how effectively you can move your campaign forward, especially in Scarborough. Because there are just not a lot, because there are a lot of people who don't speak English, or their English isn't perfect, and if you can't communicate with them in their own language, then you can't reach them. And like I said before, partner with with other organizations, as many as possible. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be working together full time all the time. But what it does mean is that you're going to be building relationships, and those relationships are going to come in handy. So whatever ends up happening, if you form a good relationship that's built on mutual trust and respect with other organizations. So let's say I'm doing transit and I know someone who's doing housing. There's a lot of overlap in terms of the people that we're trying to serve and the things that we're trying to fight for, and the improvements that we're trying to get. So just remember that working together with these other organizations is key, and building those personal relationships, I just cannot stress that enough, is like paramount. The only reason I'm here today is because Anna and I have worked on transit together since 2018. So it just goes to show. Next slide. So other considerations you might want to think of. The politicians in Scarborough are, for the most part, not very good, shall we say. So you can try to sort of build support and build rapport with them, but I wouldn't spend that much time on building that personal relationship. I would always say, be respectful, but don't be afraid to push back. Because if you can't push back, you'll always get pushed over. And that's just the way things work in Scarborough. Getting media attention is great, but if the goal is just to get media attention, it's unlikely to move the dial very far. So writing an article on anti-Black racism and getting it published in the Star, great. Is it actually going to do anything at the end of the day? Who knows? Probably not, but who knows? But it's, raising the issue. Working with allies, advocates, I've already said that, and just having the last thing I want to leave you with is just having a steady commitment, and being strategic in how you plan your actions. This is a very long-term game, fighting for better transit in Scarborough. Some people have been doing it since 2010, back when the original transit city was proposed and killed. So they've been doing it for 10 years. And literally nothing has happened. Well, some things have happened, but there has been nothing substantive in terms of new infrastructure built in those 10 years. It's just been a stalemate. So this is really not for the faint of heart, and it's really